So we're very excited to have Lindsay and all of you with us on a rainy New York morning. Thank you for coming first thing in the morning to join us. We're very, very excited to have Lindsay before she has her next big production. And I thought I'd actually hand over immediately to Lindsay because we're so excited to hear from her. We've got a sneak peek at her presentation. We're like, oh my gosh, we can't wait to hear more. So she can tell us a lot more about how we get social enterprises to scale and what does it really take and what is Intellecap looking at when they kind of go into measuring these enterprises and how to scale.
Thanks, Monica. Thank you so much for having me as well, for introducing yourself at the event that Intellecap hosted a couple of weeks ago in New York. My name is Lindsay Clinton. I'm a director at Intellecap here in New York, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the company as we get started into the presentation. But in a nutshell, we are a consulting firm and investment bank. We've been around for 15 years, primarily operating in India, but also have an office in Kenya, serving East Africa, and we're starting to go into Southeast Asia. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the model that we use to work with. But that's me. I've been with Intellecap for about 4 months now, but I have a much longer history with the company. I worked for Intellecap from 2008 to 2011 in Mumbai and ran our publications and research at that time. And we were very focused on financial inclusion at the time, and we're just starting to expand more broadly into the social enterprise sphere. And so I ran a publication on microfinance and then also started a publication on social enterprise to help the entire kind of burgeoning industry to understand what was happening amongst these enterprises. For the last 5 years, I've worked in the corporate sustainability sphere for a company called Sustainability. So much more focused on how large corporations can create social and environmental impact. But I'm really excited to be back in the world of social enterprise and impact investing and to be here with you all today. So should we copy the slides? And I'll go through my talking points, but if at any point you want to interrupt and ask a question, please do make this more of a conversation. So I'll talk a little bit about Intellecap because I think our model is fairly.
Sorry, Lindsay, 1 second. Just want to make sure we're screen sharing the notion of watching.
So I'll talk a little bit about Intellecap because our model is fairly unique, and then I'll talk about what we look for when we are looking at social entrepreneurs, and particularly from an investment perspective, what we're looking for. I didn't put it into the presentation, but I can talk about some lessons learned, some of our failures, and what we learned from that. And then if we have time and want to get into it, we can talk about how we look at impact and how we measure it. So we believe that low-income communities have many unmet needs. There are a lot of complex challenges, whether it's water, health, sanitation, education, and we think that enterprise-led solutions are a key way to solve those problems. So for Intellecap, it's all about supporting entrepreneurs and supporting business models that operate in those low-income markets and that can provide access to these many needs. As I said, we've been around for 15 years, started around 2002, and it's really about improving the quality of life for low-income families around the world. We know that there are at least 4.5 billion low-income people in emerging economies, and that their aggregate consumption level is around $5 trillion.
Sorry, it's still not showing now.
Sorry about this.
That's okay.
Sorry, yeah.
I'm struggling with technology. Hi, good day. Coming at the right time.
Is that tough?
I saw Charlotte. Yep. And by the way, it's based in New York.
So I have a shot of our offices.
Oh.
I'm based,
Oh, I see.
but I'm the only one in New York.
Okay.
Perfect. It's sharing now. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It's fine. So there's an annual aggregate consumption in the amount of $5 trillion. So there's a lot of opportunity in these markets, but those markets in which people live are very often broken, and we're not designing to meet needs. We're not creating business models that will meet those needs. And so Intellecap works not only with the entrepreneurs and business models that are serving those markets, but also with corporates that want to be involved in those markets, as well as multilateral institutions and foundations. And in that respect, we really are an ecosystem builder, sort of bringing all of these actors in to try to work in these markets. I'm in New York. I'm that little orange dot in the U.S. But we have about 75 people on the ground in India. That's our largest office, and they're in Mumbai, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. And then we have about 10 or 12 in Nairobi, enabling us to serve East Africa. But we've done work across more than 25 different countries in terms of our consulting portfolio. We've mostly, on the investment side, we've mostly invested in India, although we're starting to go into Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And we will, in 2018, start to create a fund for Africa. So the way that Intellecap works, I've said this work ecosystem approach several times. We believe that helping entrepreneurs scale is more than just about capital, provision of capital. So we were actually started in 2002, right after our founder, Vineet Rai, started our sister company called Avishkar. Now, Avishkar is one of the longest running social venture capital funds. If you know Acumen, Avishkar is very similar to Acumen, except Avishkar is a for-profit model and Acumen is a non-profit model. And Acumen and Avishkar started like literally within 6 months of each other. So Avishkar started, Vineet started Avishkar, and then thought, it's not just about the provision of capital, we also need to provide intellectual capital and human capital to help these businesses to understand how to scale, to understand how to enter new markets. And so Intellecap was started right around the same time to serve as the knowledge side, the advisory side of things. And over time, we've built out these other two areas at Intellecap specifically. So we also think that it's really important to provide networking opportunities and to bring together social entrepreneurs and impact investors and development finance institutions and policymakers. So we host a large event, which some of you might have heard of in market, called Sankalp Forum every year. So we've held it for 8 years in Mumbai. This will be the 3rd year we're holding it in Nairobi. And the 2nd year we've held it in Indonesia. We just held it last month in Jakarta. But the one in Mumbai brings together 1,200 people who are all actors in this space who want to help build it and grow it. So that's Sankalp. Just back to the knowledge piece, we are a consulting firm that competes with Dahlberg and Deloitte and KPMG at times, as well as other local firms for business from Rockefeller Foundation, USAID, Shell Foundation, IFC, etc. Often on go-to-market strategy, value chain development, business modeling, you name it, we're kind of involved as part of this space. And then just shifting over to the right side, the capital piece. So we have an investment banking team that facilitates transactions, both debt, equity, M&A, for these social enterprises. And we've also started a couple of angel investing networks. So we have a network of over 100 investors now in India, because we believe it's really important to try to crowd in local investors and not have all of the capital coming from foreign markets. And we've also started a network in Kenya, which is now, I think, 35 or 40 investors who are part of that group. So the other thing to know about Intellecap is that we are a group of companies, and so sometimes we refer to ourselves as the Intellecap Avishkar Group because Intellecap and Avishkar are sister companies, but there are a couple of other entities as well. And without overcomplicating things too much, I'll just name some of them quickly so that you understand that our group of companies, our umbrella, supports a microfinance institution in India called Arohan, 2 debt lending facilities, Intellicash and IntelliGrow. We have our investment banking team at Intellecap, and then Avishkar on the far end, which is an equity investor, seed stage equity. So amongst that group of companies, we can provide financing anywhere from $75 all the way up to $10 million, depending on the needs of the enterprise. Right now, all of these entities exist in India. And as I said, Avishkar is starting to go into other markets in Southeast Asia and will go into Africa. And we're also trying to take Intellecap into Africa as well. I don't foresee us starting a microfinance institution in Africa anytime soon, but that's kind of the family of capital providers within Intellecap. So amongst these capital providers, through our events, through our consulting work, we have kind of amassed relationships with almost 1,000 different entrepreneurs, and we've connected them with 300 investors. We have $200 million in assets under management through Avishkar. We've facilitated more than 250 million in transactions, and we have done consulting engagements across 25 different countries. Avishkar has 5 different funds. It's made 55 different investments across 8 different sectors. Has made quite a few exits as well, including 2 from different microfinance institutions earlier this year. And sum total, we have impacted in some way 28 million people who are now receiving access to products, goods, and services that they didn't have before. And these are just some of the kinds of organizations that we work with. So like I said before, sometimes it's corporate, sometimes it's foundations, sometimes it's large government agencies. So let's dive into the more interesting stuff in terms of social entrepreneurs and social enterprises and what we look for. So we look at 3 main factors. One is market opportunity, and I'll dig into that in a minute. The next is the promoter and the team. So when I say promoter, that's a very Indian word to use, but it's generally the entrepreneur, the person who has done this. So who's the promoter and what's their team? And then the business model. So I'm going to actually start with the business model in terms of the details, and then we'll go back up. It's important to just, for like a leveling standpoint, to say that when we say social enterprise, we mean a for-profit model. And I think a lot of places there's still kind of looser definitions of what a social enterprise is, but in the Indian context and in the context in which Intellecap and Avishkar work, we mean that it's a for-profit business model. And then we also look at how is that business model different from others in the marketplace, and will we need to support that model or invest in that model, and will they be able to have a competitive edge? Can others enter that same business or that same industry very easily, or is it going to be more challenging, and therefore this business model has a lot more runway in terms of operating without competitors in that space. Again, the competition factor, how scalable, replicable is the model? So how big is the market that business model is going to be able to play in? And then, of course, is there going to be value provided to rural and semi-urban segments? Is that business model improving livelihoods in some way in that market, or reducing vulnerabilities for people in some way in that market? So those are the things that we would look for in the business model. In terms of the entrepreneur and the team, the main factor and the most important thing, and this is a lesson learned, is that it's not necessarily about finding that person that really wants to do good. We're not going out and saying who wants to save the world, who wants to really make it a better place, because what we want is scale, and there are a lot of people who want to do good in the world, but so what we really need to find is a great entrepreneur who also wants to do good in the world. But the fact that they're an entrepreneur is the more important factor. And so we look for someone who has started a business in the past, run a business in the past, has a very strong educational background, and not just an entrepreneur, but the team that surrounds them as well. It's very, very important that they have the desire to scale and grow. Because we've worked with entrepreneurs in the past, you know, when we first started doing this, who it was just more about like, I want to do good, I want to create better livelihoods for people. And that's not enough for our model when we're trying to invest and we're trying to scale enterprises and get them to grow. And ideally, that person already has experience in that sector or in the community in which they're operating, so that there's a level of familiarity already. And then market opportunity, is there a need in that market? Are you actually solving a problem in that market? And therefore you will have built-in demand. How large is that market? How fast will it grow? Again, competition, who's your competition now and in the future? Is your product or service dependent on behavior change? So for us, again, because it's about scale and because it's about growth, if you have a model that is going to require entire communities to completely change the way that they have behaved in the past, then it's going to just be harder for uptake. So if you have a toilet business, for example, and you're going into communities where latrines have never been a priority and they may not be a priority now or in the future, then yes, it would be nice if everybody had a latrine, but to get them to first realize that they need one and then to pay for it is a big hurdle. And so that's not necessarily a model that you would always invest in. That said, we believe that behavior change is really important. It's just not always what we are able to invest in. Will the product or service work in low resource settings? So you've got a great app that you've designed that's going to enable farmers to access fertilizers and different farming inputs for their land, but does that app operate on low bandwidth settings, and does it require payment methods that the poor are not able to access? Well, okay, that's not a great model, and that's not going to be able to expand in this marketplace. And then does the current infrastructure and policy work in this model's favor? So ideally, you've got the infrastructure that you need, and you've got the policy in place that you, so you're not having to fight those battles in the beginning. Otherwise, it's going to be an uphill challenge. So those are the kind of main things that we're looking for as we're looking across different enterprises that we're going to work with. And the approach that Avishkar in particular it requires a lot of handholding and a lot of involvement. And we're currently working with a hospital chain where there are 4 other investors in the mix, and they're not seeing the results that they want, and so they want to get out, they want to exit. And we think that we know that we can get the results that we want, but it's going to require a lot more work on our part. And so we're actually okay with seeing some of those investors that don't want to be involved, don't want to help out, let them go, and then we will kind of dig in and do the work that we need to help that enterprise. So we're kind of in it to win it once we decide that we're going to invest.
Sorry, could you just clarify? You said that when you go in to invest, you're also entering with an exit strategy. Is that the idea, that you enter and say, okay, in 5 or 10 or X number of years, we're going to exit because this is going to be
I mean, ideally, yes, there is an exit at some point in the future. I would say, from an Avishkar perspective, I think they're generally looking to exit within 5 or 6 or 7 years, although we do recommend and think more broadly in Intellecap about a patient capital approach, and the idea that an exit would be more likely to occur in 10 years rather than 5 or 6. Avishkar is a bit more aggressive, and like I said, they're one part of our company, but Intellecap generally with the enterprises that we work with, we advise them that ideally what you want is a patient capital that's not going to expect that much growth, that much return so early on. We provide a lot of industry connections, so a lot of the value that can come from working with a social enterprise is from being able to connect them with a financial institution or with a bank or with an e-commerce player that they might not have known in the past. So it's not just about capital, it's really about providing those connections that will allow them to grow. And then also being able to help them in future fundraising, and that's one of the success metrics that Avishkar uses, is that if we've invested in a company, we've been one of the earliest investors, are they later able to get follow-on funding? And that's one way that Avishkar measures its own impact. So I have like 5 different kind of portfolio companies here, just so you have an idea of the kinds of companies that we've invested in the past. So this one is called Milk Mantra, and it's a dairy business that operates out of Orissa in eastern India, which is one of the poorer states in India. And there was an opportunity, an entrepreneur saw an opportunity that there was only a government-run dairy operating in the state, and he felt that he could come in and kind of organize the sector a little bit more and make the sector more efficient and start a private dairy company. And so that's what he's done. That's an entrepreneur down in the bottom picture. So the brand that they sell, the dairy products under is called Milk and Moo. But they work with local dairy farmers across Orissa. The model has actually been very successful, and they're thinking about taking it to another state. It's provided income increases for the farmers that they're working with, and then a valuable source of protein in the marketplace that wasn't there before in a reliable way. This is one that you might not necessarily always think of as like a social enterprise, but Vortex is this system of low-cost ATMs that can operate in rural areas. And the reason that it's a social enterprise is it's providing access to finance, access to cash in rural areas where you wouldn't normally be able to access a bank at all. So Vortex is unique in that many of its ATMs are run off of solar power, so that's kind of cool. And this was an investment that Avishkar made a long time ago. I think it was like back in 2006. So we've been involved in this model for a very long time, but it's continued to grow across India. Now there are 2,000 ATM machines across the country.
So this is sold to a bank. Where's the profit model? Where's the business model?
That's a good question. I'm guessing that they have relationships with different banks across the country. They've
So it's a
created.
service provider to a bank. That's how they,
Yeah.
they take on the cost.
Yeah.
Of the account.
Yeah.
Just outside of the cash.
Sorry.
And just outside of the cash.
Yes.
It's like-
So yeah, it's very dramatic. They just in India, the government said that all 500 rupee and 1,000 rupee denomination notes are going to be completely defunct by December 30th. But it has caused some mayhem, I think, because it just happened overnight. And I actually think that yes, it has until December 30th, but there are other milestones along the way. And so there have been crazy lines at some banks. And, yeah, my colleagues have said that some of it has been crazy, and then there are other banks where it's just been fine.
So the same model that we follow in the US, where there's a lot of corruption. Government will be run by the mafia, and they discontinue legal tender of 5,000 and 10,000. I kind of to
These are large notes. Large
These are
bills.
No, 500 and 1,000 notes, it's like $12 and $20.
But I mean, it's 80% of the cash market. So they're trying to, and they have elections coming up, so they're going to.
It's trying to get rid of black market money. But you can imagine if all of a sudden our government said $10 bills and $20 bills are no longer, like, you need to go to the bank and trade them in. I mean, I think we would go nuts too.
Yeah.
So, and there really was no warning for anyone, so I think it took everybody by surprise. So, Vortex, what must ATMs? So the next one is an artisan business called Vela. So it's all about improving livelihoods, and it's a business model that's, you're using old skills, but you're providing a new venue for these artisans to sell their products. And so I mean, we all kind of know this model. You should check out the website. It's actually a beautiful website. They make beautiful products. But they are connecting these artisans to high-end retailers and markets, and generally Western buyers who want a luxury good. And the entrepreneurs who run Vela have made sure that they have like high levels of design and quality control on the ground in India with the artisans that they work with. And so since Avishkar invested 2 years ago, the company has seen 3 times growth in their revenue. So it's a nice story worth checking out. So Nalanda is an education enterprise, and one of the brands that they operate under is called Little Laureates. So this is an affordable, digitally enabled preschool that operates in some of the rural and poorer parts of India in the east. And it was kind of surprising to me to read about this model, the fact that like you would build a chain of preschools and that you'd have all this technology, like multimedia technology in them. But apparently it has been very popular. And I mean, one thing to emphasize about this model is that just because you're poor doesn't mean you don't have aspirations for your children or that you don't want the best for your children. And so this is an example of a business that's really responding to, yes, you're poor, but we're going to provide you with a service because you're going to save and find a way to pay for this in some way. So it's been a pretty interesting model to kind of watch and see what happens. I personally don't know if you need multimedia in the classroom for like a 3 or 4 year old, but that's just my own personal opinion. And then this is the last one. This is more on the environmental side of things, Nepal Resource Management, which operates under the brand Let's Recycle in India. And they have these materials recycling facilities across India that process dry waste, but they're doing so, they're collecting from waste pickers in India, and they're giving them a better income and a more sustainable income than they would have otherwise. And they're introducing technology into the system. They've got web and mobile applications that they're using with workers and with recycling waste itself. So they've seen a lot of growth, and they've also had a large impact on the waste pickers that they're working with. So a few things, tools to support scale. It's not always about capital. So yes, capital is important. Ideally, that capital is patient capital and has a longer term horizon, but it's also about creating networks and connections for enterprises so that they can grow. It's about taking an ecosystem approach and bringing in that knowledge aspect like Intellecap does, providing consulting services, enabling a company or an entity to see what their business model should or could look like, bringing in technology in a good way. And then talent, which I haven't talked about at all, but we have found and seen that finding the right talent to enable a scalable enterprise to really grow is extremely challenging in markets. And by way of example, so we worked with this portable toilet company in India that was only really serving construction sites for construction workers. So there would be a clean sanitation system for them to use. And we thought that there could be a lot of scale in India where there are not very many latrines to be able to take that portable toilet market model and extend it beyond the construction space. But finding a CEO to take the company and expand it was nearly impossible. We finally found someone and brought them in, and then it did end up working out. And so as a result, that business has not been able to scale beyond just the construction sites that it operates on. And when you talk to a lot of people in market, they will also say that it's extremely hard to find the high-level talent that you want. And often that's because these enterprises, they're not thought of as social enterprises. They're thought of as like high potential, fast growing businesses. And therefore, you need people who don't necessarily have a social background, they have business background, but that also comes with certain salary requirements that sometimes these enterprises aren't able to meet. So I don't know, it's tough right now, and that's a big gap that's often talked about in different conferences that we go to, and that we talk about with the enterprises themselves. So that's it. So let me pause here to see if there are any questions.
And also, if there are any questions online, just type them right in.
I also did witness notes.
I have a quick question. The relationship between you guys and the companies, and the charters, do you at all interface with governments? Does the government come into this picture from a regulatory perspective, from a compliance perspective? I don't know. I'm asking this because you and we are in a relatively competitive building business with governments. There to support the governments, in place policies that are proven, that work, which is key for scaling. So I'm wondering, in your experience, does that factor in government?
Yeah, I mean, we do have relationships with governments. I mean, particularly in India, because we've been in operation for so long, and because we were very focused on microfinance in the beginning. I think there was a lot of advice giving, or maybe convening and inviting the government to be at the table in those days when microfinance was growing so quickly in India and kind of morphing quickly with the landscape, and then the government was saying, wait, this isn't the direction we want to go in, this is predatory lending, we're scared of what's happening. And so we have at different times in our past interface with the government, sometimes in more informal ways than others, but kind of from an advisory perspective by saying, we've been in this space for a long time, and here's what we think needs to happen. I think it's, we were at the Global Entrepreneurship Summit this summer out in Silicon Valley, and there were quite a few members of the government there, and we had conversations with them there. So I feel like we give recommendations and we give nudges. And then there are a couple of consulting assignments where we have worked directly with the government. So we've worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in the past on a tuberculosis-related project that involved the government trying to figure out how to bring in more private sector players to provide tuberculosis treatment. So on the consulting side, it's been more formal, and I think otherwise it's been a little bit more.
I work with library students, so this is really big. I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned something about how you technically for models, and that has been a learning for us. When we support a lot of enterprises, it's always about how do you make sure that their business plans have the profit model, always going to make people for them in that business. That has been a kind of a challenge for us. If we can just explain a bit more about maybe your views, a lot of advice agreements from people who already are in the business and to relatively expectation of that. Make sure that the business
Yeah.
forward and have profits.
Yeah. So I mean, it is definitely I think we're definitely approached by people who don't have a for-profit business model, and for Avishkar on the investment side, we just have to tell them, it's not the right time for you right now to interface with us, and there's nothing wrong with taking grant capital to help grow your business and to get you off the ground, maybe get to the point where you could become a for-profit model at some point. But for Avishkar right now, that's not for us. And then on the Intellecap side, we work with enterprises, we sometimes work with foundations to figure out what does that business model look like. And you can use a lot of different tools for doing that. You can use a business model canvas and being Launchpad and things like that to kind of help an enterprise figure out what's your profit model. But yeah, I think it's about figuring out, is there really a market here? So one way that a framework that we use to evaluate business model or not is, think about the population. There are people who bike. There are people who walk. Okay? People who walk. There are people who ride a bicycle. And then there are people who have scooters. There are people who have cars. If your enterprise is serving people who are walkers, who really can't afford to buy a bicycle or a scooter or whatever, then that's fine to be more a nonprofit model. It should be a nonprofit model because those people can't afford to pay for services. They're not taking any sort of upscaled transportation. But business models can serve the cycling, the scooters, the car owners. So we kind of break it down, like not everyone, not all segments of the population are ripe for for-profit models. They're definitely going to be that lowest level of the population that needs those nonprofit models to continue to provide services. That said, a lot of the business models that in fact, I think all of the business models that Avishkar invests in are really targeted at those who are making less than $8 a day, but they're not making money. I had a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Max. I was just curious on. Sure. My name is Max, and thank you for the presentation. And my question is more about how your organization pick up new markets. Like you say that you're moving from India, perhaps where you have a very long history, and now you're looking at other Southeast Asia. So it's more because of your business contacts, or because some characteristics in the market.
Yeah. So it's a couple of things, but our model has tended over the last 8 years to use Sunpulp, our networking event, to go in and introduce ourselves to the market and to start to bring in people together. So the Sunpulp Forum, I said it's been in India for 8 years. We've had it in Nairobi for 3, and we've been funded to do it in Asia now for the 2nd year in a row. And that event enables us to go in and introduce ourselves and to also start knowing who are the players and who are the actors. So it's been key to our model, this event, it's been key to our model, and very often people know Sunpulp. Even if you're in Nigeria, or Ghana, they know Sunpulp even though it happens every year in Nairobi. People talk to each other, people travel to the event. So that, and then our consulting assignments also enable parts of our team to go into different regions and areas and start to gain familiarity with the market. But like right now, we've established a presence in East Africa, but we're also looking at whether we should go into West Africa or we should go to South Africa. And so that starts with early conversation, just a lot of the existing players in the marketplace to understand who's there, are there gaps in the market, how can we provide value there, and that's what we're doing in Indonesia as well. So for Avishkar, Sunpulp has played a really important role because we've had this forum in Jakarta for 2 years in a row as we've been looking at the market and trying to understand where we should invest. We've made a couple of investments in Indonesia over the last 2 years as well. And all of our parts of our little ecosystem work together to enable us to get a feel for the market before we go in full scale and set down a team and start to make it work.
I'm going to step in and ask a question. Are there any coming up? So I had 2 questions. One was actually follow on from what Charu had asked you. Is when you're going in and looking at the market and saying, okay, my aim is to look at the needs of people who have at least $8 a day and above, right? $8 and below. Oh, $8 and below. So not as low as 1, but $8 and below. But when you're looking at their profitability, right, and the company's profitability, you say it's a patient investor. No, what are you looking at in terms of return on your capital? How patient you need to be by saying, okay, at least by year 7, I want to see you. What are your thresholds? That's really interesting. And my second question is quite separate. It's about your mentions of exits. That's a really interesting learning for us. But whether successful exits say, oh, we've done what we can, you guys are on to the next phase, or was it a learning exit saying, okay, our business model peaked, or we didn't get the return.
Yeah. So, so from an exit perspective, we have had a couple of IPOs in India because some of the microfinance institutions that we invested in 6 or 7 or 8 years ago went public either this year or last year. So Equitas is a big one that everyone talks about in India. Equitas is an MFI that was originally set up in Tamil Nadu, and we were the first investor in Equitas. And Vinny, our founder, really liked Vasu, the entrepreneur who started Equitas. He had a business background, so he knew how he was going to make it grow, and he had already started to set up all of the technology infrastructure and back end that he wanted to use for this MFI. And so I think from an investor perspective, there was a thought that, like, this guy's really focused on the delivery, efficient delivery of financial services to populations. So we think there's a high potential for growth there. At the same time, he already had plans in place to establish a foundation arm that was going to provide all of these other auxiliary services on the side, so making sure that people could have access to education and healthcare. And so impact was built in from the beginning and was a core part of the model as well. So I think we saw a person that had all of these entrepreneurial traits, and he also had a conscience. And the model has proved to work really well. The IPO, you'll have to look it up. I can't remember. It's like the numbers kept on growing in terms of how many times it was oversubscribed, but the returns for Avishkar were terrific because we were the first investor, and because this was a public offering, and it was actually unique in that I think it was a public offering that was only available to Indians. It wasn't available to foreign investors, as far as I know, and that was also really remarkable because they didn't make that kind of exit. So there have been a couple of IPOs, but obviously when you're talking about social enterprise and when you're talking about social enterprise that is not microfinance, it's less likely that you're going to see an IPO, and so going in with that expectation is going
So the investors you have of your, like, where does your funding come from? Are they kind of going saying, hey, this company is finally making money and now we're exiting?
So our money comes, I think it's like 65% of our funds come from development finance institutions. So FMO or KFW or IFC, they are a large portion of our investors. And then we also have, let's see, like Trudeau's is an investor, TIAA invests in so mostly DFIs, and then the other percentages, it's like 5 to 10% for private investors and network. So we're very dependent on DFIs for right now the capital that Oxford is to run. And then we determine when it's the right time to take an exit. But I think usually our investors in Avishkar have expectations around 5 or 6 years. Actually, they're fairly aligned to the VC marketplace rather than the venture capital marketplace because they're all big name investors. And the returns have varied over the years. I think depending on which of the funds you look at, because we have 5 different funds, and in the early days, our microfinance focused funds were making very small investments of $30,000 or $50,000, maybe $100,000, and I think that was also early days for microfinance. So those returns, I think, are less notable. I think what they have been getting more recently in some of the later funds is something around like 18-19%, which is really, really good. I guess the other thing I would just add generally about our strategy is that we use a strategy that we call sow, tend, reap. And this is something that we've learned over time. Because like I said, we used to do these very small investments, $30,000, $50,000, and we learned that entrepreneurs generally just need more capital than that if they're really going to grow, if they're really going to scale. And so we started making much larger investments, but still want to be the first investor or very early investor. But we make sure that we reserve money to be a follow-on investor later on. So there's that's the initial investment. Maybe now that's more like $1 or $2 million. And then there's 10, so that's that very hands-on. We're going to be on the board. We're going to be helping you understand how your food processing facility is going to work. We're going to help you build it in your remote island in Tunisia. And then if it seems like it's working, we have the money set aside to also continue to invest. And then replace when we reap our returns. But we learned that approach after some early failures or learnings that it wasn't going to work to just put in those very small amounts and hope that it paid off. And so that we needed to kind of arrange our capital so that we could make a couple of different investments along the way. Not all of our enterprises receive 2 or 3 investments, but the ones that we think have the most opportunity for scaling.
So your current model, is there a minimum that should be given? Should don't give anything under 100,000?
I think now more of Avishkar's investments are more in the like $1 to $5 million range. Obviously, it depends on the sector, and we found that like we're not really playing in the clean energy space, for example, because a project requires so much more capital. And you're looking at a minimum investment of $10 million, and for a fund like for our Frontier Fund, which we recently raised, which is the one that's going into Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, maybe Pakistan, depending on the political situation that's taking place in Pakistan. That's a right now $55 million fund. And if you make a $10 million investment on that, like that, you're not leaving yourself much wiggle room to make a lot of other investments to follow on investments. So the amount is in a fund like that is not going to be $10 million. And then we have another fund, the latest Avishkar 3 is a $300 million fund. So that will maybe make those larger investments, but to date, it's been more than $1.5 million. So Avishkar is no longer really playing in the space where we'll do that.
Do we have any more questions? We can dive into. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Connie. I just wanted to find out if there are any instances where the social impact of the social enterprise would outweigh the actual return of capital, and where you as an investor would actually not be forced, but would actually consider staying in the investment even though you're not actually making money, but the social impact is actually greater. Are there instances of which that actually happening?
Maybe in the past, maybe in some of the earlier funds, but because we're dealing with, I don't think so now. I think our investors have pretty high expectations in terms of like taking return again. So at this point, they look at Avishkar as a kind of professional investment organization, and they're not necessarily going to take possessions.
On going back to the issue of talent, because it sounds like that's real, like it may break the entire enterprise. So I was wondering, first, if you obviously went through local hire, the market in the client is much better. And if you're, I think you're working with business schools or universities to help, business school graduates understand, rather than going for that seven-figure salary, maybe there's a different kind of reward that could be interesting in a career, or what's your strategy on that?
Yeah, so, well, there's 2 different perspectives. So for Intellecap, for example, even we've had trouble finding talent, like in market in Kenya, we're trying to find a country lead, and we want local talent. It's very important to us, but it's been quite difficult, and salary expectations are really high, and our expectations are high for the skill level of that person, so that's really hard. I would say with entrepreneurs that we've worked with, generally we wanted them to have experience in that community, but more recently, I think with 2 of Avishkar's investments in Indonesia, 2 of the entrepreneurs are foreigners who are very familiar with that sector, but they haven't done that sector in Indonesia before. So we've been willing to take that bet on it because we trust their ability to replicate what they've done in the past in this market. I don't know that we're working specifically with business schools, but I mean, we know of some entrepreneurs who are in market who are working on the talent gap. So there's a new website that's starting called Shortlist, which there are actually a couple of different enterprises that are going to be working on the talent gap, and I think there's a firm that just ran an accelerator recently for companies that are going to focus on the talent gap in this space. So there are people that are thinking about it, and I think it's just nothing we need to craft.
But that's good. I guess what I gather now is it's a strong emphasis on this sustainability business online,
Yeah.
to online is metrics and goods assessment. Or do you look at social impact? How do you measure that?
Yeah.
The outreach.
Yeah.
Is that factored in at all?
Yeah, so let's actually, that's the next part of the presentation.
Yeah.
Great segue. That's part 3 of the presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Impact.
I just want to-
Oh, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it just has like a 30-second.
Makes sense.
yeah. Well, so first, before I get into the slides, I'll just say that any business, any enterprise that we're working with, like, it has to have an impact focus from the start before we engage or before we invest in them. So it's almost that we know that by scaling this business, we're going to have an impact, because that's what the business model is all about. Like I said, Avishkar has a filter when it's looking at whether it's going to invest in an enterprise, and it says, does this enterprise focus on people that are making this income today? So automatically in the business model, it's kind of, so that's an important piece. So the two main ways that we look at impact are you able to impact and increase livelihood opportunities? So are you creating new employment opportunities in areas where opportunities are already limited? Are you able to provide increased income for local farmers and producers in a market because you're bringing different efficiencies in the supply chain and the value chain, or are you improving yields so much that you're improving those farmer livelihoods? Or are you addressing vulnerabilities in some ways? So are you providing access to health, water, sanitation, financial services? Or on the environmental side of things, are you reducing environmental impacts through some sort of innovation model? So those are kind of the two main buckets that we use as we're looking at enterprises and their impact, just from a very kind of foundational perspective. But we also think that impact is very context-based. So we have started this tool. We've launched it online. It's called Prism. You can look it up at prismforimpact.com. And we think it's really important to look at the geographical context in which you're operating, or in which an enterprise is operating, in order to better understand your impact. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So a few things that we see that are wrong with impact measurement today are, one, it's not standard. It's really based on what's convenient for either you or for the enterprise. So, for example, like this young woman has a job in a factory in Bangladesh. And so the investor or the enterprise says, we've created X many jobs. But unless you're really using the standardized definition of what a job is are you talking about temporary employment? Are you talking about full-time employment? Are you talking about 8 hours a day? Are you talking about 15 hours a day? Like, what are we really talking about here? So we really need to standardize that. And so Prism, the platform I talked about, aligns itself to IRIS, the IRIS metrics, which were created by the Global Impact Investing Network. And IRIS is also now aligned with G4, which is what corporations use when they're reporting on an impact. So we can all kind of start to report in the same way, and get a better understanding of impact across the board, and we can be speaking the same language. And it just shouldn't be about like what's convenient, or I mean, often it makes sense to me what's convenient because measuring impact is expensive. But if we really want to understand impact better, then it needs to go beyond convenience and it needs to be standardized. The context piece. So let's say I tell you that we've invested in 20 schools in India. Well, that sounds great. India is a developing economy, that's great. But are you investing in the school on the left that's in Mumbai, where all the kids have uniforms and shoes and they're walking on these shiny clean floors and they have chalk and chalkboards? Or are you investing in a school on the right in Bihar, one of the poorest states in India, where the kids don't have shoes, let alone meals to eat sometimes? So what kind of impact are you making? And are we making sure that when we talk about our impact, it's all about the context in which you're working? So Prism has this really cool tool. It's a heat map. You can go on under the analytics tab, and you can look across all of these different metrics. How many houses in India have electricity, for example? And you can look at a district level or a state level at where the most need is. So we've used 2011 census data, that's the most recent census data available, to create this heat map to enable people who are either you're running an enterprise or you're an impact investor, and enable you to see where is the most opportunity to actually create an impact. That's the kind of thing we should be going for, not just randomly investing in schools for the sake of talking about it. So Avishkar has used PRISM as a way to sometimes measure its impact and to say we are in like 75% of our investments are in the poorest states in India. So the challenge of that tool is that you have to get all this government data to work with the government in order to do so, and then you have to go country by country in order to create it. So we're doing it for Kenya, we'll be launching it in Kenya in a couple of months, but until we're in every country, it's challenging to do it beyond just India or Kenya. And then we also think that impact measurement very often leaves the investor out of the equation, and it places all of the onus, just like these goals, it places all of the onus on them, the enterprises, to be creating all this impact and measuring all this impact, rather than talking about what impact are you as an investor making, what kinds of risks are you taking, how involved are you in helping the enterprise, running the enterprise, enabling it to grow, providing it with networks, and then are we measuring that? So how would you compare an Avishkar with an Acumen with any of the other people that are operating in this space and say, who's taking the greater risk? Who has greater skin in the game? And so this is another element that we measure on PRISM and enable fund managers to look at on PRISM. So, and then we also look at sustainability of the fund manager as well. Where is that capital coming from? Is it grant capital only, or is it commercial capital that is expecting returns? And therefore, are there kind of higher stakes for that investor that is dependent upon the commercial capital, and therefore they're more sustainable in the long run versus the person that's dependent on grant capital. So we also kind of factor that in and talk about how that's important. That's kind of a controversial point, I'll be honest. But it's something that I think is important for Anit, who's been running this set of funds for the last 10 years. So at the fund level, we're looking at risk-taking ability. How hard are you working to nurture an enterprise or an entrepreneur? Are you enabling an enterprise to attract more capital? Are they able to find exits and responsible exits, and is that capital sustainable in the long run? So if you're interested in impact conversation, I would encourage you to look at Avishkar's 2015 report, impact report, because it provides a lot of their perspective on impact as well as just numbers that they're using to look at their own impact. And the 2016 report is coming out this week. It might be out like today or tomorrow. Yeah, that's all. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question on, how do you measure the impact of the capacity building programs that you have? So you're helping them scale. So how do you measure is it actually effectively doing something like that?
You mean our
You said
our
you provide
consulting work?
Yeah. So trade consulting services on how to scale them to kind of nurture them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's usually pretty outcome focused. It's just being able to look and say, X organization, you asked us to figure out a model to provide financing to coffee farmers in East Africa, and we looked at it and we created a revolving loan fund for you, which now has $100,000 in it, and that is what those farmers are able to access to provide them with working capital. So I think it's more like evidence-based from our consulting side. Like, what were the outcomes of that consulting project? And did we just deliver a deck to someone, or has has there been something that's actually come from that? Is there a new business model in place? Is there a new finance infrastructure in place being created? And I don't know that we've been all that focused on that. It's an interesting question to look across, like what is our impact on all of our consulting work on an aggregate basis? That would be, we have a ton of case studies beyond just the architects. It would be interesting to look at.
Yes, do you outsource assessment when you can party, or do you do it yourself, and how you feel about conflict of interest? Since you are an advisory firm, you might have interest.
Yeah. So Prism was created by Intellecap, and Avishkar is our sister company. So you could technically say that they are separate entities, because Prism is the tool with which Avishkar is often measuring its impact. But I think that's a challenge for the sector overall. Like we don't necessarily have like third-party auditors right now that are coming in and checking impact, whereas you do have that more in the corporate sustainability space. Less on the social impact side to some extent, but very much on the environmental side. So I don't think we're quite there yet, because it's quite expensive. I mean, it ends up being a conversation of who's going to pay for this. And the investors, the LPs are generally like, yeah, we'll take what you tell us, you know, versus saying, yeah, we'll spend $50,000 to fund a third-party auditor.
I'm asking this, you know, ideally the market will provide the answer, right? Very different. There is sufficient number of requests, and with sufficient market, there will be answers. We were also asked, I believe, by a reasonable market, that if it would make sense for us to provide some services in those kind of markets.
Yeah.
So this is a difficult question for us because we also have several interests, and but it's a good way to get, you know, what would be your perception is. And then another question is reason free of charge, or is
Right now, it's free of charge. In the future, we would like it to be a sustainable business model, so we would have to charge. If there is interest in learning more about Prism, you know, there's part of the site that you can access as a regular user, but then there are parts of the site where you would need a password, and we're happy to provide demos for anybody that wants to dig in further to, okay, how do you look across a portfolio of many different enterprises and how do they impact with a score? Would you provide a score for that fund manager or for the LP that's investing in multiple different funds? So providing more.
And is it just for India and Kenya at this time, or is this across the world? Are you able to provide that facility?
It's just for India.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a little bit like India was created by portfolios and different activities. I was wondering if you also consider specific areas of information like a partner one, such as women, or if you take any gender considerations and just which businesses you support, or also maybe in terms of participation of diverse enterprises led by women.
Yeah.
That's one question. So the second question is about scale and how big is the scale that you are expecting? How you measure it?
So women. Avishkar does end up reporting on its investments that have women as board members, or it also in some of its investments for development talks about number of women impacted. So it's definitely something that we think about and talk about. I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure if that's a lens that we go in with and say, we want to make sure that we fund X many enterprises that are focused on women. I think it's just like, it's one of those elements that we like to see, and that is definitely like, those are part of like the vulnerable populations that we look at. Intellecap, for its part, has started at least one very woman-focused entity, which is called Credit Tree, which is a debt lending platform exclusively focused on women in India so that they can access loans from banks. Because right now there are many women who want to start enterprises, but they don't even know like how to go and talk to a bank, and banks often don't really know how to talk to women. And they expect women to have collateral, and often things are owned in men's names. So women don't necessarily have that collateral or assets to look back on. So we had started Credit Tree to educate women about how they can get loans from banks, and to also make connections to them to mentors who can guide them in their business, and also to banks themselves that are willing to loan to women. And so we have a partnership with Yes Bank on that. Goldman Sachs has funded that platform to help them expand, and then recently received some money with FMO to help them expand that platform. So we definitely think about it. I used to work in a women's leadership organization. It's really important to me personally, and I think for a lot of people that work at Intellecap or Offshore. But to say that we have like a women's track right now, we don't. And then scale. What kind of scale do we look for? I don't know. I'm like, how do I get to that? Is it like numbers of people? Is that? I feel like it's one of those things where it's like we know it when we see it. Like, is this business going to be able to expand to other states, expand to other countries, reach tens of thousands of people? I think the challenge that I've seen, having worked in the social enterprise space for many, many years, in India in particular, you see all of these amazing entrepreneurs or really interesting business models. But if they don't have scale, they're just not going to have impact that we need to like solve the problems, like to meet the SDGs. We're just not going to get it. So I think it's less about giving you a specific answer that it's about X number of people or X number of communities, but it's like, can we look at this business and is there the potential for exponential growth because it's solving a real problem, but it's going to be able to expand. Yeah, I think that Avishkar would like to diversify that funding group, and I think that now that we have a track record, we're better able to do that. So I know in the U.S. right now, we're looking at more mainstream funders who are interested in making great returns in emerging markets, and they wouldn't necessarily call themselves investors. They're investors, and they're looking for interesting opportunities. So I think more and more, we're going to be able to serve that constituency that maybe wouldn't have looked at us in the past, and we wouldn't have even tried to talk to them. But now we have a track record of these things. Go in that space. And then with the ecosystem, I mean, I think it's, we've built the ecosystem in India over the last 15 years from a point where like no one even knew what social enterprise was, and people didn't know what microfinance was, and now there are like accelerators everywhere, incubators everywhere. And so we've been funded by USAID and Shell Foundation to recreate that ecosystem in Kenya and in East Africa more broadly. So that's why we're doing some helping in East Africa. We have a consulting team on the ground. We have an investment banking team on the ground. We created our angel investor network. We're trying to bring Intellecap there. We're bringing some of our technology platforms there. But for us, it's about not just the entrepreneurs, but the investors, the policy makers, other friends and actors in the space, and it's about talking to everybody.
You guys interested in
Yeah. We're definitely interested. I've had a couple of meetings here and there with different parts of the UN. I think it's a matter of figuring out like what are the priorities for the different departments within the UN, and then how can we provide value and help meet those goals.
Thank you so much. Almost on time. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Lindsay.
Yes, anytime.
all running back to our desks in the day. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming out and really listening.